The story of Lehman Brothers did not begin in a high-rise office in Midtown Manhattan, but rather in the dusty streets of Montgomery, Alabama in 1844. Henry Lehman, a young immigrant from Bavaria, opened a small dry goods store that would eventually become the cornerstone of a global empire. When his brothers Emmanuel and Mayer joined him, they found themselves at the heart of the Southern economy, which was driven by the trade of white gold, cotton. By accepting raw cotton as payment for goods, the Lehman Brothers inadvertently became commodities brokers, learning early on that the value of an asset is only as stable as the market's perception of it. As the American Civil War loomed and eventually passed, the brothers recognized that the future of wealth lay in the North, specifically in the burgeoning financial hub of New York City. They shifted their focus from physical goods to financial instruments, helping to establish the New York Cotton Exchange, and later pivoting into the financing of the great American infrastructure. For over a century, Lehman Brothers was more than a bank. It was an architect of the American dream, providing the capital necessary to build railroads, expand the oil industry, and fuel the rise of retail giants. They survived the Panic of 1873, the Great Depression of 1929, and two world wars, creating a legacy of resilience that made the firm feel eternal. However, the culture of the firm began a slow, tectonic shift in the late 20th century. The transition from a partnership where every senior member had their own skin in the game to a public corporation changed the psychological landscape of the office. Risk was no longer a personal burden, it was a corporate strategy. By the time Richard Fuld, nicknamed the Gorilla for his fierce and intimidating leadership style, took the helm in 1994, the firm had developed a hunger for growth that surpassed its historical caution. Fuld had a chip on his shoulder, having seen Lehman nearly collapse under the ownership of American Express in the 1980s. He wanted to prove that Lehman could compete with the titans of Wall Street, like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. This ambition coincided with a period of radical deregulation and the advent of complex financial engineering. In the early 2000s, the U.S. government's decision to keep interest rates low created a massive influx of capital into the housing market. Lehman Brothers saw this as their golden ticket. They didn't just participate in the mortgage market, they industrialized it. They acquired lenders that specialized in subprime mortgages, loans given to borrowers with poor credit histories. These loans were then sliced, diced, and bundled into residential mortgage-backed securities, RMBS, and collateralized debt obligations, CDOs. On paper, these instruments were miracles of modern finance, supposedly spreading risk so thin that it practically disappeared. In reality, they were a house of cards built on the assumption that housing prices would never fall. Lehman's leverage ratios climbed to dizzying heights, often reaching 30-1, meaning for every dollar of their own money, they had borrowed 30 more to invest in these toxic assets. As the year 2007 dawned, the cracks in the subprime foundation became impossible to ignore. Foreclosures began to rise, and the value of mortgage-backed securities plummeted. Yet, inside the glass walls of Lehman's headquarters, the denial was palpable. The firm used an accounting maneuver known as Repo 105 to temporarily shuffle $50 billion of debt off its books at the end of each quarter, making its financial health appear far more robust than it was. They were essentially dressing up a corpse for a beauty pageant. When the rival firm Bear Stearns collapsed in March 2008 and was forcibly sold to J.P. Morgan Chase, the spotlight turned directly onto Lehman. investors began to smell blood in the water. Short sellers attacked the stock, and the cost of insuring Lehman's debt against default skyrocketed. Despite the mounting evidence of a catastrophe, Fuld and his team remained defiant, convinced that the government would never let a firm as old and as central as Lehman fail. They were waiting for a bailout that would never come. Negotiations with the Korea Development Bank and other potential investors fell through as the world realized that Lehman's books were a black hole of uncertainty. The confidence that had taken 150 years to build was evaporating in a matter of months. The climax of this tragedy occurred over a single frantic weekend in mid-September 2008. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York became a war room where the heads of every major bank were summoned. Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson delivered a blunt message: there will be no public money. The titans of Wall Street were told they had to save Lehman themselves. For 48 hours, sleepless bankers pored over Lehman's ledgers, but the more they looked, the more they recoiled. Barclays was interested, but couldn't get the necessary approvals from the British government. Bank of America, seeing a better deal elsewhere, abandoned Lehman to buy Merrill Lynch. By Sunday night, it was clear. There were no more white knights. At 1:45 a.m. on Monday, September 15th, the firm filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The news hit the global markets like a tidal wave. In London, Tokyo, and New York, traders stared at their screens in disbelief as the unimaginable became a reality. Thousands of employees, many of whom had their entire life savings in Lehman stock, walked out of their offices carrying their belongings in cardboard boxes. The image of those boxes became the visual epitaph of an era of excess. Why did the government let it happen? Some say it was to send a message about moral hazard. Others believe it was a miscalculation that nearly destroyed the global economy. The immediate aftermath was a state of total financial paralysis. Because Lehman was so deeply interconnected with every other major bank, the entire global credit system froze. Nobody knew who else was holding Lehman's bad debt, so banks stopped lending to each other entirely. This was the Great Recession, a period where businesses couldn't get loans, unemployment surged, and millions of families lost their homes to foreclosure. The government was eventually forced to step in with the TARP program, a $700 billion bailout to prevent the rest of the banking system from following Lehman into the abyss. The lessons of the collapse are etched into the regulations that followed, such as the Dodd-Frank Act, which sought to end the era of too big to fail. It taught the world that liquidity is a coward. It disappears at the first sign of trouble. It taught us that transparency is not just an accounting requirement, but a survival necessity. Most importantly, it revealed the fragility of the social contract that underpins the financial world. When the rewards are privatized among the elite, but the risks are socialized among the taxpayers, the foundation of trust in capitalism begins to crumble. Looking back, the fall of Lehman Brothers serves as a haunting reminder that no institution, regardless of its age or pedigree, is immune to the laws of gravity. The transition from a story of immigrant success to a narrative of systemic collapse is a cautionary tale for the ages. It is a story of how a firm that helped build America ended up nearly tearing it down. The lesson is that in the world of finance, hubris is the ultimate toxic asset. As we navigate the complexities of the modern economy, the ghost of Lehman Brothers remains, whispering a warning that every period of irrational exuberance has a day of reckoning. The price of that reckoning was paid by ordinary people around the world, while the towers of Wall Street eventually regained their height. But the scar remains, a permanent mark on the history of the 21st century, reminding us that wealth can be created over centuries, but destroyed in a single weekend. The legacy of the three brothers from Bavaria is now a synonym for a systemic failure that changed the world forever.